Hey everyone, welcome to Magic the Gathering for Advanced Players. I wasn't planning on making a video today, but there was a really interesting conversation that started on Twitter about ghosting and streaming and the ethics of not new topics, but I think there's some new angles brought up. I wanted to summarize those, both sides of the argument. I'll tell you a little bit about where I come out, but I think more importantly, just what are the real arguments, not the kind of knee-jerk first impulse necessarily, some of the deeper arguments. So first, is ghosting unethical? So ghosting, opening up someone's stream if you're the opponent in that game, looking at that opponent's stream and using that information that they've chosen to reveal in real time and using that info to do better than them at the game or improve your game. So people have different opinions on this. I think the more popular opinion is yes, it's unethical. The reasons being, you have to make some effort to get access to that information. They're not broadcasting it to you necessarily, even though you're part of the general public. They're not intending to reveal information to you. It's just a byproduct. They're trying to deliver something to the fans, improve the way the game is presented to a fan audience. As a community, streaming helps us attract new players, engage with each other. And the people who are ghosting are kind of these jerks that are, basically exploiting this part of the technology that they're not able to broadcast to everyone but their opponent in real time. Common sense dictates that you just stay away from it. That's the argument against streaming, and it's fairly persuasive. I think there are some good arguments against that, however, arguments that it's unethical, or excuse me, arguments that it is ethical to exploit that information. I think the strongest argument is probably that, look, everything that's not explicitly out of bounds, meaning prohibited by the rules or technically, not feasible to the extent where you're, hacking or something. But if it's simply I decided to release the information, it's not fair for me to say my opponent is unethical for looking at that information. So an analogy would be in paper magic, if it wasn't on a computer. If I held my hand like this above my head to show a spectator behind my opponent, hey, check out my hand. Isn't this going to be an awesome moment? And as the opponent, maybe it's not directly in their line of sight, but all I have to do is look up to see it. Would I really expect that my opponent isn't going to look at it? Would I really say my opponent's a jerk for looking at it? Or would I say, well, I chose to show my friend the information, and so that's kind of a byproduct of that? And what's the best way to disentangle what's ethical and what's not in gaming? Well, in general, the best approach is to have simply, hey, in a competitive event, public information is public, private information is private, and although I shouldn't try to make private information public, if my opponent does it, then that's now public information, I can go use it. So that's a fairly persuasive argument, pretty good argument. Additionally, I think there's an argument to be made that, hey, the streamer has a live chat. When they chose to broadcast live, they're choosing to take in information from their chat, potentially in real time. And a common refrain you hear as well, streamers are better than their viewers, so they don't get a lot of information. Well, A, that's not always true. Not every streamer is LSV or Ben Stark. B, a lot of times the better players or the more well-known players might be modded or VIP in that chat, so their chat stands out. It's not that hard for me to go into a stream of a friend of mine and type in, oh, by the way, their creature has first strike because of this or that. Those little bits of information. Also, it doesn't have to help you every match. It might even hurt you streaming on average. If there are some matches where it's helping you, then you're potentially cheating those opponents. So they started it. They started it's never a great argument, but in a sense you say, look, either stream on a delay or come what may with public information. I think that's fairly reasonable. You have the ability with your streamer settings to stream on a delay, to use a hand blocker, to some alternatives that, again, we have the technology, it's free. If you choose not to do that, then you're saying I'm inviting multiple things. Live real-time chat, which may help me, and ghosting, which may hurt me. Okay, another argument, last one, something that Paul Rietzel raised that I found interesting is that additionally, streamers are actually creating an unfun environment for their opponents by playing slower on average. So they're decreasing the fun in the ecosystem. Others, like Patrick Sullivan, talked about how they may also be eroding the consent by streaming their opponents' play mistakes without their approval and their username. We'll talk about that in a moment. But so the streamers are kind of there, and they're doing potentially doing it for monetary gain. So if you're going to do that, you got to live with the consequences, and it's kind of, you can't have one. You got to take the whole basket, the good and the bad, of streaming in real time to a public audience. Okay, so having shaken out both those arguments and some counter arguments woven in, how do I feel ultimately? I do feel it's unethical because I feel like, on balance, they started it is not a good enough excuse for me to be unethical, right? Just because my opponent may be getting outside assistance doesn't mean I should go get outside assistance. So I may continue to say, hey, in a competitive event, you ought to use a delay, and I'll continue to make that argument. But that doesn't really excuse me going and grabbing the info. So I feel like that's pretty persuasive. That's how I come out on it. I also feel like, it's basically a bug in the technology that opponents can't broadcast to public but opponent. That's just not a setting. And so it does feel a little bit exploitative. And lastly, it is an active step. I've got to go grab that information, so it is a little bit different than the opponent opening up their hand in a way where all I have to do is glance up. I mean, opening up a browser and typing in their URL, I mean, that is more work. It feels more deliberate. It feels less ethical. So on balance, I do feel like ghosting is unethical. I don't think it's this wildly unethical thing or this really easy argument. So hopefully I'm bringing some nuance to the discussion. There's no need to yell at people over this because, again, hopefully I've articulated two pretty reasonable positions. So that means we can agree to disagree. And we can hope that Wizards take some steps to, address some of these issues. And that really takes us to our next topic that came up on Twitter, which is also really interesting. Is streaming itself, the game state, which is influenced by both me and my opponent, which includes both my decisions and my opponent's decisions and their mistakes, without my opponent's consent, is that ethical? Is monetizing that when they get no share of the revenue, despite contributing, some percentage to the work product of their effort and their, privacy? Is that unethical? And so Patrick Sullivan, who usually has a well thought out, nuanced take, had one here and talked about how, just because they signed up to play a game doesn't necessarily mean that they signed up to have their mistakes and their play patterns broadcast and their username. And so, there's something he said. He's not saying that's like, they're robbing your bank account, but he's saying it's something we ought to at least acknowledge and talk about. I saw some other good arguments that people layered onto that, added in. One of them that I thought was pretty intelligent. When people post a screenshot of a game they played, a lot of people have the intuition that they ought to be blacking out or blocking the opponent's username because the opponent didn't necessarily want that screenshot uploaded, especially if it's an opposing play mistake. That intuition is now even stronger. So if I have that intuition about my opponent's screenshotted gameplay mistakes, and I have that intuition to some extent, why would that not carry over to my stream? Where I'm now broadcasting their plays, good, bad, or otherwise, alongside their username in a way that's not blacked out. That brings us to our first point, macro point about, I think Wizards should offer the technology to mask your username more easily, especially now that play points aren't transferable and cards aren't transferable on Arena, and play points aren't transferable on Magic Online. It's not easy to switch accounts. My account is Sperling. When I go play test for a Pro Tour, it's annoying. I gotta use my real name. If I wanted to play against someone and not let them know, hey, I'm practicing, I may be making a lot of mistakes, I can't really do that. My play points aren't transferable. My Arena cards aren't transferable. So Wizards ought to add functionality to anonymize your username. That's gonna help. And they could even offer it to streamers, anonymize your opponent's username or block my opponent's username. Both of those, all that functionality, I think, is sorely missing from a marketplace where people are having these arguments where there's a technological solution that will kind of get us there. But now turning to the counter argument about consent, I don't think so. Ultimately, I don't find that argument that Patrick made very persuasive. I think that ultimately, if you think about it from the perspective of expectation of privacy, meaning like, is it really a violation of my, look, I'm playing a game, my decisions are broadcast to my opponent, they're going to spread that around. Streaming is common, screenshots are common, recorded videos are common, and I don't think that I should expect that stuff's never happening to me. I should expect that it's happening to me, a chunk of the time. Those streamers are part of the online gaming ecosystem, and I'm going to encounter them. If I don't want that to happen to me, maybe when I select my username, it shouldn't be Sperling. It should be some anonymized thing before they deliver that functionality that lets us have both. Ultimately, also, I don't think there's a lot of harm. So you look about, the expectation, not really persuasive. In terms of the level of harm, I don't think it's that significant. They're not broadcasting your person, your likeness, your private, data or imagery or anything like that, or thoughts. It's really just the decisions you make in a game. And although some of them can be embarrassing, I mean, to me, that's just not a high degree of harm. And so I think from that one also tilts towards there not really being an issue. And it's also just impractical to think that we could obtain consent in this setting. And so although in a perfect world that we'd have some other functionality, would I even want to add like a consent into streaming? I'm not sure I would. Again, I think that we can, if we agree that the harm is low, the expectation is low, what's actually being broadcast, ultimately, the people who are going to be jerks and make fun of someone's play, yeah, those folks are out there, and certainly, I've been one of them in the past. I like to talk about mistakes. I try not to harp too hard on, doing it deliberately, calling someone out, but I go there from time to time. Ultimately, I don't think it's that big a deal, but that's just my personal take on it. Should Wizards add functionality that would let people hide their identity versus a streamer, let streamers block it, whatever, any or all of that? I certainly welcome that. I think that does get us to a better place. But absent that, I don't think there's an ethical issue with streaming without your opponent's consent. So these are, interesting topics. I wanted to, get this video up there to kind of share my take on not just where I land, but where I think the better arguments are on each side to help frame this. Again, it just doesn't have to be a shouting match. If we got reasonable people on both sides, we can just talk about, hey, I found this part more persuasive. Well, I find that part more persuasive, and here's the feature and functionality that I want to see Wizards deliver to address my concerns. So if you have any of that kind of commentary, please let me know in the comments or pop into Twitter. Appreciate it.